Okay, right.
Sorry, was it your turn?
Yes, it's my turn now. So yes, I'm Malcolm Tredinnick, and everyone else took a step back when we decided who was going to moderate this panel. I wasn't fast enough, so I'm stuck doing the moderation, but I also have opinions, so I'll be answering some questions. So yeah, nominally this is a panel on web frameworks in general. It may be the least prepared panel you've ever seen in your life. Yeah. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so I thought to start off with, run down the table. I don't care if Richard goes first or Russell goes first. Who are you and what's your involvement with what web frameworks do you use generally? What's your involvement here? Why are you here?
All right. I'll go first. I mean, you may have I've just presented a talk on MicroFrameworks, which is my primary use of web stuff. I also develop Zope at work, and I've written a bunch of web frameworks. The Python package index or cheese shop, I mean, that's one of the web frameworks I've written that I'm quite embarrassed about. So yeah, I'm more of a get in and do it myself, although I have used Django, and Django's awesome, but I haven't contributed any code or anything.
So my name's Dylan J. I run a company and we do CMS development. So we use Plone, which is the largest, most active Python CMS, and is used by a lot of sites out there in the world, like CIA, FBI. It's incredibly secure. We also do some pyramid stuff, and of course Plone is built on Zope 2.
And I'm Russell Keith-Magee. I'm a Django core developer and president of the Django Software Foundation, which is the IP and fundraising arm of Django. I have gone through a series of jobs essentially building Django websites, except not in the usual capacity of a web development shop where someone comes to you as a customer and wants their website for their new product. It tends to be building an application that is on the web that then becomes a product that is sold. So by volume, by number of websites, I haven't actually built that many, but the ones that I've built have ended up being very, very large and complicated and lots of form processing and security issues and what have you. So my interest in being involved in Django is mostly to support my web-based application stuff that I am and have previously built.
And I've done a lot of Django work as well over the years. Mostly, I don't like the web very much, so I mostly focus on back-end and middle layer stuff. But I have worked for websites that have had over 100 million users. My microphone doesn't seem to be working very well. And so yeah, I have some user-based experience as well. I'm tempted to claim citation needed on this. Plone is the most popular CMS. You can, of course, produce the evidence for that. Okay, so pick someone at random. Dylan, maybe. What do you look for when you're choosing a framework beyond I only work with Plone? I mean, how do you look around at other frameworks from time to time and say, am I still making the right choice, or what can I steal from them? How do you approach that sort of problem?
I mean, when you talk about frameworks, it's kind of interesting because this is something I try and put in the front of each of my slides, is that there's a difference between a CMS and a web framework. So a CMS is kind of like batteries included, and if you want CMSs in the world people know about, there's the Drupals, the Joomlas, the WordPress, and all the other PHP ones, and the rest of the world, and there's a few other ones in different languages, but in terms of maturity, Plone is it in terms of features and everything like that. For the lightweight stuff, I gave a talk on Pyramid. I think that is a natural choice for people who come from the Zope world and the Plone world because it uses a lot of the same idioms. And yeah, I mean, I've used Tornado as well and G-Event and played around with stuff like that. But I think the biggest problem with all these things is there's so many frameworks. Unless you're Richard and sit down and play with all of them, most people are going to pick one and go for it and learn it.
Well, and if I might add there, yes, it was interesting writing that talk about the frameworks because in the end I evaluated something like 14 micro-frameworks, only 10 of which actually made it into the talk, but before I did that, I had actually done some work using one of them, thinking it was the best solution for what I was doing. But as it turns out, there was something better, and now I'm using that. So it's really hard to, unless you're going to spend a considerable amount of effort, it's hard to actually analyse these things and figure out which one's the best. Even given the rather enormous amount of information that's out there for each of the mega frameworks.
My backstory is vaguely relevant here. I came to Django by virtue of some tinkering. I have enjoyed programming in Python, but was never doing it commercially. The reason I got to Django as a core and became a core developer was that I had an idea of this thing I was tinkering with and figured, hey, the web is a way of making it happen, and looked around at a bunch of options. This was sort of the time when Ruby on Rails was just starting to get a lot of press. Zope was around, and that was how you do it in Python at the time. And this Django thing started up, and I tried Cherry Pie and I tried Ruby on Rails, and none of them really stuck. Just the mental model just didn't quite work. I didn't quite get where it came from, or how they were trying to do what they were doing. And then Django had extraordinarily good documentation, extraordinarily good at the time, still good. Could be better. There are some areas where it's fallen down, but still very good documentation. And it made sense. When I sat down to try and do it, it made sense. And as a result of that, I got more involved and submitted patches and became a core developer, and the rest is history. In terms of looking around at other options, I used to spend a lot more time looking at other frameworks to see what else and what ideas can we steal type stuff. Honestly, I haven't spent a lot of time doing that of late in the last couple of years, mostly because of available time, but also because Django's doing everything that I need it to do. There is a bit of a gap emerging where I'm kind of wondering things like all this sort of long poll request, dynamic content page, dynamic content stuff that Django doesn't have a really good story for that but I also don't have a personal need to pursue yet. I imagine though if I needed to actually build it, I'd go and ask Alex how to do it. Alex Gain, another core developer who's done a bunch of this sort of stuff. And find out, can we do that in Django? Should we be using another framework? And that would be the time in which I start looking at other options.
One more perspective on that, as a business owner, there's another aspect to picking technology. I think in the Python world where people who like aesthetics and like to find the best possible framework, at the end of the day, you've got to employ people to create those applications, and the skills that are out there actually has an influence as well. And I think that the fact that Django is so popular is incredibly good, because that means that you can go out. I know that a lot of people are going out to the market trying to get Django people and maybe not getting it at the moment, but that's going to create more Django people. You will find lots and lots of Django developers, and that is a really good thing, a reason to pick Django. If you're doing a side project or something like that, great to experiment and try other things. Unfortunately, the logical extension of that argument is that we should all be doing PHP. So
the logic eludes me. Something specifically, I guess, for Richard, but I'll throw some commentary in at the start. When I'm using Django and when I'm using frameworks in other languages, the ones that stick with me the most are the ones that actually I can use them as a library rather than a framework, in that I call them rather than they call me. So sort of Western world versus Soviet Russia or something. And something like Django is probably 10% framework. There's very few bits that actually call into your code, and most of the time you're calling Django. So, I mean, the Django libraries. Richard, you're the one with the sort of most experience sitting at that table, running around with different ones of these things, having evaluated, for example, the MicroFrameworks. Do you sort of get the feeling that that's some kind of discriminator or quality indication or something, how much the framework bottles you up inside what the framework wants to do versus how much you can...
Absolutely. We have one system at our work where it should have been implemented behind a MicroFramework, but unfortunately it was implemented as a TurboGears application. And so it's structured in the TurboGears way, which isn't actually that bad, but there's a whole lot of additional baggage around it about configuration files and the way TurboGears does things. I'm not saying TurboGears is bad, it's just that it turns what should be a very simple and straightforward application with obvious entry points and so forth into something that's not as obvious and not as straightforward. And so this is why in my talk today I didn't really talk about, I explicitly didn't talk about the mega frameworks, because they, in all of them, in their own ways, they dictate what your application is going to look like. Whereas with the micro frameworks, you're pretty much open just to say, look, here's a callable thing, publish it to the web. And it doesn't really matter where that callable thing comes from inside your application. And you know, that gives you so much flexibility.
As a corollary of that, if I could, that question that I sort of wanted to ask then, but I knew this panel was coming. The thing that's weird for me as a Django core developer is everyone coming up and talking about these micro frameworks, and these micro frameworks are really great because they're so lightweight. The weird thing is for me, I look at Django and I think it is a micro framework. But I appreciate there are axes on which it isn't, because it is a large download and it does a lot of stuff. But this sort of generation, and by this generation I mean the Ruby on Rails, Django, Turbo Gears, not so much Turbo Gears maybe, but well, I suppose it is really. There are mechanisms for translating a request to a function that returns a response. And there's a lot of other stuff around the outside of that is necessary. But what's in your mind, you know, having used micro frameworks both in action and for that talk, what's the line that separates the mega framework that is Django from the micro framework that is Flask or Bottle? Or
well, it's a pretty simple distinction. Can the application be developed in one file? Okay. And none of the mega frameworks will let you do that. There's always, and in fact, in some cases they may, but you have to do some fun tricks to define these new data structures inside your one file that have nothing to do with the application to make the application work. And so that, you know, that additional overhead, that additional burden means that it's not lightweight anymore.
Okay.
How often are you building web applications that are really sensibly only one file though?
All the time. Yeah. A simple example would be I have an application. It's not actually one of the telco ones, but we have a whole lot of log files around you know, 24 or so systems. We aggregate them in a central point. We index them using that awesome indexer that I've forgotten the name of, the pure Python one.
It'll doesn't have a name. He might mean Whoosh.
It'll
he
come
might
to
mean
me.
Whoosh though.
It'll come to me.
I know the one you're talking about.
It's really cool.
Do you mean Whoosh?
Sorry?
Whoosh?
Yeah,
Whoosh.
Yes.
Whoosh. Whoosh is awesome. And so it indexes those things, and the web interface for that is a single file, because it doesn't do much. It handles a post and renders a response, and it's all in the one place. You want to know how the web interface works, you look in a single file, and that's nice.
I think the other aspect to it is learning curve. It's like, you know, you take something like Plone and you can do lightweight stuff with it, but there's loads and loads of documentation of all the other stuff it can do, and Django probably sits halfway in between. You know, it has the ORM level and stuff like that. So there are all these distractions of learning what not to use about a mega framework. And the CMS is essentially a mega framework. You know, it's very opinionated. I think the one other aspect I want to talk about is that there's a trade-off, because what you get with Django to some extent, and things like Plone even more, is that you get to reuse more bits of code. You know, something like Plone has a plug-in architecture, so you can plug in a mailing list manager, or you can plug in an e-commerce framework, because it knows where the users are, where the content is. It's opinionated about all those different things, so you get a massive amount of innovation and functionality around that. But in order to create those things and learn those things, you've got to learn more framework. So the CMSs are good for people building sites for other people on a regular basis, because I will have to train someone up for 6 months to get up to the level where they can you know, do productive things. Things like MicroFrameworks and stuff like that, you can learn in you know, half a day.
Yeah, Bottle you can learn in like half an hour.
Yep. Following on from that, Django has always had this sort of tagline of for perfectionists with deadlines, and I've been known to shout at people in capital letters on mailing lists that it doesn't say for beginners with deadlines. What about this learning curve versus power thing? Because there is this sort of beginner entry-level stuff, but nobody stays a beginner forever. You do actually move up the curve, and maybe you hit the cliff, or maybe you fall off the cliff. Do you think we're kind of getting the balance right there with the larger frameworks versus the smaller ones?
We're definitely doing better than Zope 2.
Damning with faint praise, but okay.
Actually, yeah, I think there is one, like from an educational perspective, I think there is one really big benefit to the micro-frameworks in that they force you to understand what HTTP is. I mean, there is a persistent refrain on the Django users mailing list of, I want to do this thing, and I want to call off a fork in the middle of my request and run this half-hour process. It doesn't seem to be working right, and it's locking up my web server. Well, yeah, because that's what's going to happen. That's not how HTTP works. And and this was part of my undergrad degrees in physics. I came through artificial intelligence and landed in software engineering. I never formally studied HTTP, and it wasn't until, essentially it wasn't until I got Django in my hands that I really got a feel for, oh, this is what the HTTP spec is all about. Now I get what you're doing. Because the micro frameworks are so close to the metal, they do force you to realise that it is just this pipeline of function in, request in, response out, and you can't have a long-lived thing, and it can't consume lots of resources, and that's a valuable education exercise in itself. Django then has a bunch of stuff that's on top of that, but still exposes it to you at some level. So, yeah.
But do you think we're maybe putting too much or too little emphasis on the entry-level side of things as opposed to the power user? Like, everyone on this stage is reasonably power user of the things we use and could probably pick up most things fairly quickly. But
I'm not a power user of Django, but I can pick it up in no time.
Yeah. I mean, but you're a power user of many other Python
I am,
things.
yes, but they don't translate. I'm a power user of Zope 2, and that infects your head. I mean, that changes the way you think about things.
Been there, had the therapy.
Look at me, I'm an example.
But I've developed a couple of very simple websites in Django, but I do not consider myself an expert. In fact, I've developed them in 0.91 or something. So most of the stuff I learned is no longer valid. But I know that I can pick it up again relatively easily because the documentation is well laid out for a beginner. So there's really very little curve there for the learning.
But there's also, I mean, there's a matter about sensible defaults. The obvious way to do it is the sensible default way to do it, and you don't need a great deal of extra extra boilerplate around the outside of that. Django then gives you all sorts of other ways that you can plug in your own template language and your own forms library and get into the internals of an inline form set and tweak all that. So it's a matter of having an API that's rich enough to let you get in there and do the hard stuff. Yeah. But the default version of just render this form, damn it, works and protects you from CSS and XSS.
Yeah, I guess that's where I was going to. How much does the easy, low barrier to entry interfere with when you then want to go and do power stuff?
Just before you go on to that next question, I think the other thing to think about is that I don't think we can have enough of the beginner stuff. I mean, because so many people come to programming from PHP. That's the first bit of programming they do. People are exposed to the web. People want to create their own website. They then want to add a bit of dynamic stuff to it. The more we have the ability to create really easy Python stuff, the less they can go through having to touch PHP, and that's a good thing.
It's
the less damage we have to undo later on.
Yeah.
All right, so we got about 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left. Thought we might open it up for questions from the floor. Remember, a question is a sentence that ends in a question mark. So if you start with, I have a comment, that's not a good start. Microphone over here, so stick your hand up if you have a question.
Your last question.
Pardon?
Your last question.
My last question?
Does making it basic make it hard to...
Yes, does. So yes, are we, I mean, I think it's sort of, I'm getting the feeling of what the answer is, but yes, I was wondering if anyone felt we were making it. I definitely agree with, we can't have too much beginner stuff, but at the same time, you shouldn't then get to the point of, I want to do something really difficult and I can't do it because stop holding my hand, damn it. I'm actually, I'm allowed to take the training wheels off, Python for consenting adults type of stuff.
I don't know. I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. Good API design allows you to do both.
Absolutely.
And I mean, there are areas in Django's API where we don't do a great job at it, but I'm sure that's true of any framework that's evolved over a period of 8 years or something at this point. So, good API design I don't think precludes having both beginners with easy defaults and experts being able to munge the internals to the point you don't recognise them anymore.
Extensibility at multiple levels.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, I think I tried to sort of emphasize that a little bit in the pyramid talk yesterday, is that you can do it in one file. You can have something very simple, but it has so much extensibility, and that is, you know, learning the lessons of other things that needed to be extended in different ways and building the framework with that in mind. And it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but documentation's a big one as well.
Yeah.
We have a
Question from the clouds. Okay, so independent of MicroFrameworks or MegaFrameworks or Jurassic frameworks, what do you want to call them? One of the things that Malcolm mentioned earlier was, I think, was PHP. Do you think the predominance of people, or PHP on hosting servers and cloud and all that sort of stuff, is holding people learning the right way with Python, and the difficulty of hosting that is holding Python back, independent of whatever you choose?
Yes, I agree. I think it does. And I think there is something as a community that we need to have a very long, hard talk, you know, amongst us and, you know, all the other guys who manage these projects, about coming up with a solid story that we can sell to hosting providers about, if you put product X on your website, we will send you customers, and all they will need to do is give you a blob, and the blob will run on the website in the same way that you send you a PHP file and it just runs.
Yep.
No, the model that it's vaguely applicable is kind of like the Java bean thing. Someone's got a J2EE container, you give them the bean or the WAR file, and it goes off.
Django on Jython was actually a good example where you could package up Django as a WAR file, and it would run, like, literally they would just drop it into Tomcat and it would run.
Yeah, and I mean, the WSGI gets one part of that picture in terms of, here is an API that lets us all agree that you could plug it into Apache or any other WSGI compliant container, but it doesn't cover where the WSGI file is in the zip or in the collection of code, and it doesn't cover where do I put my static files and how do I define the dependencies. Now, I hope we haven't missed the boat on this, because we have got, particularly in the Django, pseudo-Django community, things like Gondor and EPO and Django Zoom, that are commercial companies that are realizing people want to launch their Django website easily. In the case of EPO, it really is just WSGI, but, you know, Django is obviously a big thing because Andrew is a Django core developer. I hope that before these guys get too entrenched and have their own market shares, that we actually find out what the lingua franca is, work out what the set of specifications are, and they all agree on a spec that we can then publicise as something that anyone can implement, come up with the way of we can ship that, and, you know, productise Django deployment or Python web deployment as a thing in the same way that PHP makes it easy.
I mean, I think from the CMS world, you know, Drupal, Joomla, WordPress are so incredibly popular, and because you can run them on, you know, you can go to cPanel on any, you know, $7 a year hoster and click and go Drupal instance. Installing Plone is really easy using easy install. You know, you just go easy install Plone or build out or whatever. But that's just too hard. That's the thing. It's like, I think we're a little bit of a suffer from the fact that we're all a bit of a Linux nerd. You know, we kind of are used to command lines and things like that. And there's a whole bunch of talented programmers out there who aren't. You know, we can't be too snobby about this. We have to create easier ways to do hosting and deployment.
I'll also say the dark side of the PHP easy to install Joomla or WordPress particularly is shared hosting providers are very happy to do that right up until the point it starts using lots of memory or bandwidth or database, at which point they're saying, please take your WordPress install somewhere else, and you're really SOL at this point because you've now got to learn how to migrate a database and dump the database and put it somewhere else.
But you're already pot committed. That's a thing, you know. It's
the pain point comes a little bit later. Is, you know, I've seen. I'll also say I take a much more curmudgeonly viewpoint on this sort of thing. My general feeling is you must be smarter than this stick to use the internet, and the web is a dangerous place. And if you're, you know, not quite at the point that installing, you know, your web framework in your shared hosting account is something you can do, maybe it's time to not go and play on the road just yet. And I mean, that is a very severe position, and I think, you know, there's some middle ground to be had there. But there is going to be a big fat end of, let's call them stupid people, who, you know, get something out there as they're still learning about security and stuff like that. And it's the 1990s all over again, right? There's so many exploitable websites out there and problems like this that maybe having a little bit of a barrier to entry, a driver's license, is not such a bad thing here.
Yeah,
So
the problem with that argument is that if Python takes the high ground there, they're just going to go and use PHP, and that there is always going to be someone who will sell the unlicensed driver at Hugo that they
PHP can clean up the blood. I mean,
It's the Microsoft thing of, let's release something that's buggy first and then get the market share and then fix it later.
I want to save the web, not the stupid people.
Good point, sorry.
Okay.
They would never
Someone
do
else have a
anything like
question?
that.
Elena's standing there with a microphone, so I'm taking that as a no. Oops.
Just following on from Richard's last talk with all those number of micro frameworks, do you guys think that it's sort of, looking at how many of those are so similar, do you think it would be better to keep the diversity of those, or for those sort of things to sort of combine together to provide a really solid micro framework, which could then sort of, be a really good sort of launching pad up into something like Django or, the other more sort of complicated mega frameworks?
I would love to see the core of some of these things put into the standard library so that people don't have to keep re-implementing the layer on top of the CGI module. But beyond that, I'm happy for there to be diversity. Even though it does mean that sometimes you might not pick exactly the right thing, even having the one that's not exactly the right thing is still way better than writing it yourself. So I'm happy for there to be all this diversity.
Yeah, there's sort of two sides to it. On the one hand, I agree that the diversity, particularly in the early days, is really valuable because let 1,000 flowers bloom and you find the good ideas and they'll all steal off each other. The point at which I think that starts to become counterproductive is after 3 or 4 years, when the ones that were never good ideas to start with kind of die off, and you're left with 2 or 3 major contenders who are fundamentally doing the same thing in slightly incompatible ways, but which then means that you've got duplication, triplication of effort, which is essentially what has happened with Django, TurboGears, Pylons. 3, yes, they've got some differences, but the things that are similar about those frameworks is bigger than the things that make them different. Dylan made this comment, also used the example of the Precambrian explosion in biological evolution. There was a period in Earth's history where the Precambrian explosion happened. There were thousands and thousands of new species, and most of them died off. And we're left with sort of the 12 basic body forms of all life on Earth were developed during that Precambrian explosion. We have been through the explosion period of the Django TurboGears era and now the MicroFramework era. I think we need to start looking at the consolidation bit. And there are how many different ways do we need to implement a HTTP request and a response object before we say we're duplicating everything? I think it's the job of the core developers of Django and Pyramid and Pylons and whatnot to sort of say, well, yeah, okay, let's see what we can share off each other, and yes, make our routing module something you can use, and make them a lot more compatible and integratable. The problem with that is it's a great idea, but who's paying for it? This is the open source dilemma, that there is a lot of stuff that would be really, really cool to do, but I have no spare time left. So unless someone really gets enthused and drives it and presents patches that says, here you can now deploy Django as a Pyramid application, or whatever, it's not going to get done because Django works and I'm happily using it. And it would be better if it's shared code, but there's no dramatic incentive to do it as as an activity straight off the bat.
I think it's a little bit heartening to see things like Pyramid, for instance, which is where the result of BFG and Pylons getting together and saying, well, Pylons has hit a wall, we're going to combine the two things, talk to each other and create one thing. So it does happen. It's not all gloom and doom that we're never going to share stuff.
Hi, I'm an end user of Django. I work primarily with the Django web framework, and typically when I have something that I can package up that might be useful to others, I know the standard way of doing this is to take the Python, the non-Django bits, and create a Python package, and then and then for the rest of it, if I have something that is very specific to that involves JavaScript and CSS typically, I release a Django package that has the Python one as a dependency. And I was wondering, is there, so I get a lot of complaints about why why isn't there more reusable packages across frameworks? Like why don't
Django's or
share?
plugin doesn't work in Pyramid or whatever,
And it's really hard to. I mean, it's not like you can really share these types of packages. But I was wondering, what about maybe what would you think of some sort of spec to for a uniform interface? Or I don't know if it would even be possible, but just curious.
It's largely a race to the bottom is the problem, because at which level do you stop trying to be compatible? We're already compatible on one level, which is the WSGI level, for all its flaws and warts and stuff. But if at the point that everything works everywhere, you've just got one framework, right? There's no, and I don't agree that it's time for consolidation everywhere. For example, there's still differences matter, because being fully generic, trying to be every solution to every problem actually leads to something that is not quite the right solution for any problem. There are arguments to specialize.
I think the other thing is that, to do what you say, which is to have, interfaces for each of the different kind of components, then you'll back up the stack where Plone is, which is a very, very opinionated, large amount of APIs to learn. So the problem is then you're learning all the different APIs, which is fantastic for a company like mine that's willing to put the time in, and then you can create packages that will just work in any other Plone installation and add functionality. And I know that Django kind of goes to this Pinax and things like that, right, where they're trying to share bits and pieces of features. And it's hard, because you've got to have those very clear interfaces that say how the features work together, or what the schema is, and so on. For those are very hard problems to deal with, and the trade-off is the learning curve, I think.
Yeah. And it's also, if you take a problem like authentication or something, like a common user model, so everybody knows how to log in. Well, you've got to have a database representation. Well, okay, you've just made a decision about whether you're going to use the Django ORM or SQL Alchemy or some non-relational store. So all of a sudden, you've got that's an axis on which there is no compatibility by definition, unless you then have a back-end API in your authentication framework to allow people to implement different storage engines. So it sort of gets very, very complicated because of the things that are just different between frameworks. That said, there are areas where I think, like I said before, how many different implementations of a request and response object do we need? And once you've got that, then yeah, anything that just relies upon request and response could be shared between projects. The WSGI spec and the WSGI, the WSGI middlewares, you can use them in Django, you can use them in Pyramid. There are some efforts, hopefully will get landed in trunk in Django pretty soon, to make it obvious that you can do that, or a lot more obvious that you can do that. So yeah, there are technical reasons why it's difficult. There are some opportunities for removing some of those technical limitations, but some of those limitations will always exist. It's because we are different projects.
So just in the last few minutes, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. I just wanted to go back to throwing it over to the panel for a minute. Something else that sort of flared up in this space at the, I don't know, it's the high level or the low level, is the whole whiskey debate has kind of opened up again with Richard's about to dislocate his eyeballs here as he rolls them so far back in it. Philip Bevy's come out of the woodwork and saying, oh, look, all this whiskey fuss is not, I don't know, you guys don't understand what I'm doing. Here's a micro whiskey spec, which is fully backwards compatible with whiskey, which to my mind doesn't seem to fix the problems at that point. Make some predictions. How does this sort of thing pan out? Like, I have opinions that I'm probably not going to say here, but how does this kind of thing play out over the next little while? Are we stuck with whiskey? Is it salvageable with a whiskey 2 or whiskey 3 or whiskey 13? Is it we need a couple of parallel interfaces to things? Richard, go for it. You're dying to say something.
Oh.
Polite.
I'm not even going to try and predict. I kind of trust that Philip Beeby gets it right sometimes, and that I'm going to hope that he gets it right this time as well. WSGI middleware is hard to get right. It's really hard to get right, but I don't think it's doomed. And the WSGI interface has certainly been very useful in unifying the interface between the Python applications and the web servers. So it hasn't all been for naught. And even if WSGI middleware is given up on, WSGI is still useful. So Given that the new efforts in cleaning WSGI up are fully backward compatible, let's see if it can give us something new and something better.
I take a slightly backseat approach here in that I don't have enough spare cycles as it is, so I kind of let the WSGI debate go on over there, which is a slightly embarrassing thing to say as a person who's a core developer on a web framework, but it's a similar sort of position to what I do with Python as a language, and it, again, is also slightly embarrassing to say as a maintainer of a major Python framework. I treat Python as a tool. I trust that the people who are managing the Python project, they have a long history of demonstrating they know what they're doing, and I'm going to wait to see what comes out. I don't, as much as I would love to be involved in it, I just don't have enough hours in the day. As soon as someone invents the time machine that lets me have 47 hours a day.
Lends the time machine to
okay,
you,
okay, awesome. So once that happens, then yeah, sure, I'll be able to get involved. So I basically am relying upon the people who have a vested interest coming up with something that works and coming up with an implementation, and then I'll build against whatever implementation they come up with. For my purposes, WSGI works. As it currently stands, it does everything that I personally need it to do. I appreciate it doesn't do everything that it needs to do. I'm waiting for the people who care about the stuff that WSGI doesn't currently solve to fix that problem, and then I'll do whatever they say.
My polite version of my thoughts, given the code of conduct here, is that WSGI, I mean, the best WSGI implementations around, including things like mod WSGI, do not just stick to the WSGI spec. They actually implement things beyond the WSGI spec. They fill in the unspecified areas to do something useful that turns out to be useful. You can't do certain things in the WSGI spec via WSGI. I mean, you can't be spec compliant to do things like streaming content within an organization, for example. If you know there are no proxies out there and you want to do chunk transfer encoding, you're not allowed to do it using WSGI because it explicitly says you can't set transfer headers, for example. And I'm a bit fearful that only having one gateway interface like that is an error, because we're focusing on a particular use case that, okay, very well might hit 85% of the people or 90% of the people, but it still means the other 10 to 15% exist. And so in the days where we had modern Python, or, I mean, we still to some extent have fast CGI, but it kind of is ugly and not really well supported, and SCGI has drifted out of the picture in the last 8 or 9 years. That was around with the Kyoto sort of days. It worries me a bit that it's not just we're saying, you know, there are other alternatives for those other 10%. We may be saying there are no alternatives for those other 10%, and someone's going to reinvent SCGI in 2 or 3 years out of desperation here or something. I'm particularly thinking for internal corporate cases, not necessarily public internet cases, where you've got a lot more control over the end-to-end stuff, using HTTP as a RESTful transfer mechanism. It was a lot less controversial than you predicted it was going to be, Richard.
Monkey fight anyone?
I have emails saying we will probably spend most of the panel talking about this. So, or IM logs or something.
I'm pretty much done.
It flared briefly and everyone, oh, not again. All right, so we've got time for one more question. Yes, she gets her chance.
Yay. Hi, I'll introduce myself. I'm Miriam Hochwald. I founded Girl Geek Coffees, which is trying to get the students to network with each other, and hence you'll see hopefully more girls here and have a bit more to be able to chat to them and have the input. What was established this morning in the girls programming network is there's basically not enough high school teachers that know how to program, and therefore you can't actually teach the guys or the girls in high school programming. This is a bit of a concern if you want, like, you know, more girls around. One of the things that they do there seems a bit more of a movement towards web, so girls might actually pick up web, it's a bit more socially acceptable. My question is about if you can do more funky things with Python in the web, you know, how can we actually use that to actually, you know, as a plug and play so that they can skill up in that area in programming? So
I have my mother and my mother-in-law are both teachers, so I kind of, my answer here is slightly tinted by what I know or what I suspect they would probably tell me if I asked. It's that they need the teaching materials to tell them how to do it. They actually need to be trained how to do it, and then they need the syllabus and the workbook and developing course materials is hard.
Yes.
So the course materials need to exist, not necessarily just giving them and here's the course to teach, but the source materials that let them know what's a good idea and what sort of projects you should do and how do you break that up over a 12-week semester or whatever.
And mapping it back to the curriculum.
And mapping it back to the curriculum or the education outcomes or whatever it is they've got to hit in order to meet their key performance indicators for their education requirements. So if essentially that is something that needs to be developed. I think Zed Shaw has done a really good job with Learn Python the Hard Ways. Here is a book that takes you from nothing to building a really primitive website, and it's cool. It's like you could give this to a student, work them through it, and they've just built a website on the internets. There is plenty of room to build volume 2, volume 3 of that, and to put it on a mobile phone, and here's your kids playing with their mobile phone on the internets, and it comes down to building the course materials, I think, and that's an extension of the documentation issue, is that you can never have enough tutorials and enough in-depth walkthroughs and what have you.
I think something like App Engine has a huge scope for that. I mean, it's so particularly you've got the Mac install where you can just go green button deploy. It's so immediate, and then you've got all the logs and everything like that, and you can see what's going on. I think that there's a lot of scope. There probably is already tutorials aimed at high school students around that.
I think it sounds more like a syllabus issue that you actually need to give the easy, like the plug and play version of actually how they can directly implement it in their course materials, and also to learn it themselves, more importantly, because they don't know how to program. So
there's a breaking the dam issue too, with sort of anything new, getting it on the radar and getting it accepted as credible and worth the investment of time is always a hard thing. And so, someone has to be brave / stupid enough / not concentrating enough to sort of sign up and say, okay, I'll try this out. No, crap, it's great, let's go. All right, so our time is up. So thank you to the 3 people who sat there and answered questions.